buenos días para los que están escuchando en las Américas. Bon dia. Thank you very much, Chris, and Chatham House for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. The last time I was here, and the last time several of us were here, many of us were here, was 2 years ago for the last Chatham House conference on Latin America. And in those 2 years, obviously, the world has changed. Latin America has changed. People's lives have changed. And the region has suffered grievously from the pandemic. With 8% of the world's population, it's suffered around 30% of the officially recorded deaths. We've just heard about the economic impact. We've also heard about the impact in terms of increasing poverty. And in particular, I would highlight what Marcela has been telling us about the grievous impact on the education of a generation of children and the very great risk that that will worsen inequalities and lower the future earnings of poorer children in Latin America. Now, we've also heard that the region is close to recovering its pre-pandemic level of output. In 2022, there's a fairly good chance of it returning to normal, in inverted commas. The really dramatic thing is that normal, that pre-pandemic normal in Latin America was mediocre and problematic, with 6 years of economic stagnation or at best, slower economic growth. And with that, the narrowing of opportunities in the region. And this accompanied by socio-political discontent and the public perception that democratic politics was discredited by generalized corruption, whether or not that was correct. And I think that narrowing of opportunities rendered intolerable the multidimensional inequalities that exist in Latin America. It's not just about income. It's about treatment. It's about access to opportunity, to public services, to public goods in general. There is also in Latin America at the moment a generational factor at work. There's a generation of young people who are more educated than their parents. In many cases, they went into debt to get a higher education, and at the end of it, they find that they are not able to get the kind of quality jobs that they expected and hoped for, and they're frustrated. It's a generation that communicates with itself through social networks, and there's a divorce, therefore, between the street and the system, let's say. I think the pandemic has served to intensify those tendencies. At the beginning, there was what political scientists call a rally around the flag effect, with presidents getting credit for having imposed swift lockdowns. But over the months and years, that has turned to frustration and rage. And this discontent, generalized discontent, which I stress predates the pandemic, has expressed itself in three main ways. The first, and this is the single dominant trend in Latin American politics, is that almost every election is won by the opposition. Anti-incumbency is the mood, the public mood in Latin America. We've just seen it again in Honduras at the weekend. We're likely to see it in Chile. We saw it in the Argentine legislative election, and so forth. The second manifestation of discontent was the election of populist presidents of distinct varieties in both Mexico and Brazil in 2018. Countries, it has to be said, which at federal level did not have a particular tradition of, a recent tradition of populism. And then clearly the third manifestation of that discontent has been mass street protests in several countries over the last 3 or 4 years. There are important elections coming up in Latin America, one in Chile in a fortnight's time, a little more than a fortnight's time, in Colombia and Costa Rica in the first half of the year, and in Brazil in October. And for me, the big question is whether the region's democratic political systems will be capable of processing these discontents, of creating new consensuses, of forging the new social contract that many Latin Americans want, with greater social protection, and setting the stage for a resumption of faster economic growth and tackling the question of productivity that the previous speakers have stressed rightly, or whether it is that the region will face more years of polarization, discontent, political paralysis, and with that the risk that a return of creeping return of authoritarianism that we've seen in recent years, whether that will gain strength. Before I introduce the speakers, let me just remind you that this conference is on the record, and it's also being recorded, and that you can tweet about it with the hashtag #CHLatAm. Now, to discuss these very big questions, we have an excellent multinational panel. Andrés Velasco, former finance minister of Chile, now the dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics. Marina Silva, former environment minister in Brazil, in happier and more successful environmental times in Brazil, former presidential candidate and leader of the Rede Sustentabilidade party. Mauricio Cárdenas, former finance minister of Colombia, professor at Columbia University, and I think possible presidential candidate. Mauricio, you will tell us about this, I'm sure. Colombia has a wealth of, an enviable wealth of plausible centrist presidential candidates. And then last but not least, Vanessa Rubio-Marquez, who has held a number of senior jobs in Mexico's public sector, and is now a professor in practice at the School of Public Policy at the LSE here in London. So with that, over to you, Andrés. We look forward to hearing your views on this.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks to Chatham House for the invitation. Delighted to be joining Mauricio, Marina, and my colleague Vanessa on this panel. I think Michael set the stage very, very well, and I think many of the trends that you underscored and highlighted are visible today in Chile. And I will mostly talk about Chile, but try to place my country in a regional context. As everybody knows, Chile had elections a week ago, 10 days ago, and the word that comes to mind when thinking about those elections is surprise. Chileans have surprised the world. Maybe we have surprised ourselves more than once, beginning perhaps with the unrest and the street violence of late 2019, which, whatever people might say now, and there are many people saying, yes, of course I saw it coming. Truth is, no one saw it coming. And the same is true of the results of the elections this past Sunday. The conventional wisdom, if you read, maybe not The Economist, but the bulk of the international press, was that Chile had turned left and that changes in that direction were inevitable. And surprise, surprise, the winner of the first round in Chile is a man of the extreme right, who thinks that if Pinochet were alive, Pinochet would vote for him. who wants to cut taxes, who wants to exercise mano dura against anything that smacks of crime, and of course, who is waging Trump-style anti-woke cultural warfare against the feminist world, the LGBT plus communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Chile has again surprised the world, not necessarily for the better, but there it is, something that many people were not anticipating. How should one begin to interpret what is going on in Chile? I think one starting point is to recognize that Chile is having its own populist moment. Of course, Chile does not have the strong populist tradition of Argentina, Brazil, or other countries in the region, but that does not mean that we are immune to populism. We've had episodes of left-wing populism. We're also now experiencing at the same time an episode of right-wing populism. I think the first important thing to keep in mind when interpreting the elections of last Sunday and what might happen in 2 weeks' time is that reading the results exclusively in a sort of a right against left key may be misleading. As Michael suggested, and I'm going to develop that point a bit more, maybe new against old or establishment against sort of anti-establishment may be better coordinates for understanding what happened. The key fact of the election is that the candidates of the established parties of the center-right and the center-left did terribly. The center-right came in fourth with about 12% of the vote. The center-left, ex-concertación, which ruled Chile for a long time, came in fifth with a bit more than 11% of the vote. By contrast, not only do we have Mr. Kast, we have Mr. Boric, who is certainly from the far left. And in third place, we had a guy called Parisi, who never set foot in Chile, campaigned from Alabama in the United States because he has too many pending lawsuits against him in Chile. And via Zoom, he was, managed to campaign and get 13.5% of the vote. So this is really an anti-establishment election with a lot of populist elements. Second fact to keep in mind, and I think this again is indicative of some trends present elsewhere, is the complete collapse of the center. The complete collapse of the center. Not only were the center-right and the center-left presidential candidates relegated to fourth and fifth place, but if you look at traditional centrist parties, they did absolutely terribly in the congressional election. The Christian Democrats, the sort of, centrist party of Chile par excellence, which provided two presidents, which historically captured as much as 1/3 of the popular vote, was relegated to the ninth place in terms of members of parliament it managed to elect. Parisi's party, which was created quite literally 2 months ago, now will have more members of parliament than the Christian Democrats, which is an extraordinary fact. And the same is true of the other center-right parties like Evópoli or center-left parties like PPD. The collapse in the center in Chile is of extraordinary proportions. To some extent, this is of their own making, or I should say of our own making, because I think of myself as a man of the center-left in Chile. One big problem of the center-left parties in Chile over the last couple of years is that they were cowardly. They did not push their own ideas, and they tried to imitate what the far left was doing. And between the real thing and a copy, voters preferred the real thing. And that's why progressive voters went with Boric, not with the center-left. The third trend that is worth highlighting in Chile is that voting patterns across the electorate were very, very different this time than in previous elections. With the exception of 2 or 3 very wealthy comunas in Chile, in Santiago, Historically, the share of the Socialist Party or of the UDI party on the right was pretty much the same in the north of the country, the center of the country, or the south of the country, no more. In terms of geography, this election showed that the north of Chile, the center of Chile, and the south of Chile are completely different political communities. In the far north, Parisi, the demagogue, did very, very well. In the center, particularly in Santiago, Boric did quite well. And in the south of Chile, Cast simply swept the election, not only in the prosperous bits of the south of Chile, but also in the very poor bits of the south of Chile, in Araucanía and in Biobío. This is completely new. This has never been a feature of Chilean elections in the past. And much like Mike suggested already, there was a huge generational divide. Cast swept the election among voters 40 or over, and Boric swept the election among voters 30 or under. So again, you have a country divided along geographic lines. You also have a country deeply divided along generational lines. What's next? Let me mention three things and I will end. The first thing is that the election remains wide open. As I'm sure you know, Boric is ahead by 2 or 3 points in some polls, by 6 or 8 points in other polls, but it's still 2 weeks to go, and with as much as a quarter of the electorate very much undecided. The key to the result in this election will be who votes. If the vote keeps older voters at home, then it is Boric's elections to lose. But if the older voters turn out to vote in substantial numbers, then the election may be too close to call. The second thing to realize is that no matter who wins, the era of divided politics, volatility, and confrontation is nowhere near its end in Chile. Chile, like most other countries of the region, has a presidential system with a fixed term of office for the president that is married to a proportional electoral system. And the outcome of that is that most presidents in recent years, with a partial exception of Bachelet II, have not managed to put together majorities in parliament. And whether Boric or Cast happen to be the next president of Chile, neither will have a working majority. So whoever wins will make a ringing speech with lots of promises on election night, and on Monday morning, he will have to face the cruel reality that whether it's the extreme left or the extreme right, they don't have more than 1/3 of parliament. And parliament will be very heavily fragmented with lots of little parties holding 4 seats here, 7 seats there. Internal party discipline, never a strong suit in recent years, has collapsed. So it is very, very likely that whoever is in the Moneda Palace will be mostly unable to get legislation through. And of course, this is not only a recipe for paralysis, it is also a recipe for frustration. You promise a lot and then you deliver very little. Last but not least, and I will end on this note, the big question, the big hope, but also the big tricky issue is the Constitution. The convention did not get off to a good start. There was a lot of posturing, but gradually there seems to be emerging a working, I was going to say majority, maybe not quite a majority yet, that is hoping to put together what is really at the core of the Constitution, a workable political system. The current mixture of presidentialism and proportional electoral rules is simply not sustainable because, as I said already, it yields presidents who never are in a position to legislate and govern. Will the Constitution yield a more workable political system? I think that is the billion-dollar question. I am more hopeful today than it was 2 months ago, but it's not a done deal at all. We will know more beginning in March when the Constitution begins to take shape and when the convention begins to vote. Between now and then, it'll be a rocky time for Chile and a very rocky time for the region as a whole. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrés, for being so concise and so clear. Before turning to Marina Silva, let me just pick you up very quickly on that last point. Do you think the outcome of the presidential election will have, in either direction, will have a significant bearing on the chances of a viable political system emerging from the Constitutional Convention, or not?
I think the mood will clearly change. What is viewed as feasible or infeasible will probably change, but I'm not sure the dynamics of the convention would vary a great deal depending on who the president is. Meaning there have been discussions for quite a number of months now. There have been 1 million working groups and working parties and seminars and task forces and all of that. Will that change depending on whether Mr. A or Mr. B is president? I don't think it'll change radically. What has changed already, and that will have a bearing on the convention, is that the result of the overall elections in plural, the presidential and the congressional election, did send a signal that Chileans want evolution. The Chilean electorate is not keen on revolution. And I think that change in tone, that change in mood, which has already taken place, will make a difference in what the convention eventually chooses to do.
And Mauricio, over to you in Colombia, please.
Well, thank you, Michael. Good to be in this panel with Andrés, Vanessa, and Marina. And let me use this 5 minutes equally between the more general aspects in Latin America and the more specific ones related to Colombia. So the topic of the panel is the trajectories and the intersection between the political and economic trajectories. And for that, let me say, and let me organize my thoughts around 3 ideas. One, as you mentioned in the introduction, I think in this election, there is a clear disadvantage of the incumbent. Regardless of ideology, regardless of which political parties are backing governments, the incumbents are at disadvantage because of the disastrous results related to the management of COVID, number 1. Number 2, the social explosion and the social unrest that has been present in a number of countries for the last 3 years. And number 3, the scarring effects of this pandemic, the legacy effects of the pandemic. We're seeing a number of consequences that go beyond GDP. Governments talk a lot about the recovery of the economy, but underlying that recovery, there is an increase in unemployment, poverty, and of course, the worst of all the scarring effects, which is the loss in learning. So those are big disadvantages. And I'd say that to me is fact number 1. But there is also an advantage to the one who runs the budget, because COVID has been the perfect excuse to increase government expenditures. And not just government expenditures, in general, unsustainable policies. Think, for example, of the use of pension savings, policies that are related in part to the social explosion and the way governments responded to that, but also policies that governments have adopted on their own. Some of those policies, and we're seeing that in Colombia, we're seeing that in Brazil, have an expiration date, which is precisely the end of the current administration. So the next administration will have to bear the consequences of stopping those programs, cash transfers, employment subsidies, or continuing them. But those policies have, of course, generated a benefit for the incumbent and the political parties that support the incumbents that profit politically from those programs. And the third element is that the next administration will have to deal with a very difficult situation. The legacy, the heritage coming from the current administrations, it's going to be really difficult because presidents are going to be elected under platforms that promise not just the continuity of those programs, but also promise the solutions to some of these consequences of the COVID, and also the expectations that some of these promises that are resulting from the social explosion and the way to deal with them. So I think the next administration in most of the countries in Latin America will just have these very difficult task of squaring the circle. What will happen? I think that's the question. What will happen once these new governments are sworn in? Will there be a continuity of these unsustainable policies? Therefore, are we going to continue in the direction towards a crisis, that there will be a fiscal crisis or an external crisis because of the unsustainability of policies? Or will the next administrations in the region adjust? And therefore, will the next administrations in the region will become politically very unpopular very soon into their mandates? I think the answer to that question depends a lot on the external environment. We haven't talked about the external conditions that today are as good as they can possibly get in terms of access to financing at low cost, in terms of commodity prices, and in terms of the growth of the world economy. So if those conditions continue to prevail into the next few years, of course, the future administrations in the region will not necessarily have to deal with a very serious adjustment. But if for some reason things tighten up in the world economy, then the next administrations in the region will be forced to do some type of adjustment early on. Now, what does that mean for the future of the region? Thinking in terms of the next 5 years or the next 10 years. I think that this transition, this trajectory could be either the opportunity for reform under the excuse that countries need to make an adjustment post-COVID and that things cannot continue as they are now, or it will be the road to disaster because governments in a very fragmented political system with very weak majorities in Congress will just have to muddle through and will not be able to do major adjustments. And in that case, we will be heading towards a crisis later on during this decade, a crisis that will be triggered by the lack of access to external financing, the sustainability of debt in the region, and the need to renegotiate the terms of that debt. So in my view of things, these elections are decisive, are turning moments in our history because we could be beginning a decade that will be reformist, that will take this as an opportunity to adjust, reduce government expenditures that are inefficient, and cut where it needs to be cut, deal seriously with the issue of corruption, or it could be also a continuity of the current status quo that would just head towards a major disaster. Let me end with a reflection about Colombia. Despite what appears in first impressions, this could also be an election in 2022, very much in the same spirit of the 2018 election, in which the peace agreement with FARC plays a center role. You start hearing from the members of the center-right coalition a discourse that reminds very much of the 2018 elections, saying that it's unacceptable that the previous FARC leadership is sitting in the Congress. and that the transitional justice system needs to be reformed. That will mean that Colombia will be polarized again in that space, which to me is very unfortunate, because the challenges of Colombia today are different from the challenges of the implementation of the peace agreement, are the challenges of the effects of the pandemic. But it seems that from a political point of view, that type of rationale and that type of argument is really what provides more content to the political platforms. And let me say that all hope is not lost in terms of having a centrist government, but the odds are relatively low, because what we're seeing, at least in terms of the polls, is that the more extreme points of view, which are at the same time more populist, tend to have higher favorability in the polls. So that means that the centrist platform will need to work its way up in terms of support to be really an alternative in the May 22 elections. And let me finish with a comment on the possibility that Colombia joins the club of countries with populist governments. Colombia has not done that in its history, in its recent history, and it could very well end there. The main reason is the fact that there is significant dissatisfaction with the establishment, the fact that the youth are now the group in the population that has the majority in terms of electoral participation, and also the fact that the current crisis is very much interpreted also as a crisis of the system. Very little discussion about drug trafficking, which is a pending issue, and the way to deal with the drugs problem, which I also see it's resonating everywhere in Latin America. Andrés, Velasco, and myself were in Ecuador a few weeks ago, and the issue there was drug trafficking. If you listen to Cast's speech the day of the election in Chile, he mentioned the word drug trafficking at least a dozen times. And if you listen to the debates in Brazil as well. So drug trafficking, a very central issue that hasn't been addressed in a successful way in the region. So this is part of the pending conversation that we have as a region. And I stop there.
Thank you very much, Mauricio, and thank you for setting it so much in the regional context. Let me just press you a little bit on Colombia. I mean, you're there, but I must say it surprises me to hear you say that after everything that has happened in the last 2 years in Colombia, that you think that the election will be a kind of rerun of 2018 with the peace agreement at the center. That does surprise me. But my question is, I mean, Andrés has just told us of the complete collapse of the center in Chile. The center hasn't collapsed in Colombia yet, at any rate. What does it have to do to win this election? How can it win this election against those populist tides that you mentioned?
So emotions play a very important role in elections. And the two dominant emotions today are the fear of Colombia going in the direction of Venezuela, the famous or infamous Castro Chavismo, and also the rage associated with the consequences of the pandemic. And those sentiments, which are very strong, are captured by the two more extreme and polarizing views. The center hasn't been able to generate a sentiment that compares to that. The idea of order is well established. The idea of change is well established, but the idea of change with order has a deficit of emotion.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mauricio. Marina, Silva, já podemos oír a senhora?
Sim.
Yeah, bom dia.
Sim. Obrigada.
Thank you.
Boa tarde.
Good afternoon.
Sim, sim, sim.
Yes, I
Estamos
am
prontos.
ready.
Boa tarde.
Yeah, que bom.
Good
Muito
afternoon.
obrigado e estamos por
Thank you.
ouvir a senhora.
Thank you. We're ready to hear from you.
Uma boa tarde.
Good
a
afternoon
todos.
to all.
Primeiro eu quero
I
dizer
would
que é uma
like first to
satisfação
say that
poder
I'm very
participar desse
happy to be
painel,
part of this panel,
sobretudo
above all,
porque ele trata de algo
because it
que
deals with
é muito
something
relevante para a
that is
América
very
Latina,
relevant
como
for Latin
olharmos
America
para a
and
nossa
how we
região
look
e
at
na
our
realidade
region
de cada de nossos
and in
países,
the reality of
fortalecermos
all
a
our countries
democracia,
and be able to
combatermos as
strengthen
desigualdades
democracy,
sociais,
thinking about
enfrentarmos o grave problema
inequalities and
da
thinking
crise
about
ambiental
the
global
serious
na busca
crisis
de novo
of the
ciclo de
environmental crisis,
prosperidade
looking for a new
em
cycle
que
of
a gente
prosperity
possa
in which we can
proteger as imensas
protect
riquezas naturais
the
que
great
temos na nossa
wealth
região.
that we have in our
Eu
region.
queria
I would
começar
like to
fazendo uma
start
breve
by
contextualização.
talking about
Para
the
mim
context
discutir
very
a nossa
briefly.
região
In order to
se
discuss our
insere
region,
dentro de
we
uma
have to think
quadratura bem ampla, no
about
contexto de
a
uma grave crise que o mundo está
conjuncture
vivendo.
and
E
the
para mim
serious
se trata
crisis we're
de
going
uma
through
espécie de crise
that has to do
civilizatória
with the
que constitui-se
civilization
múltiplas
crisis,
crises e agora
which is
agravada
made up
pela
of very
pandemia.
many crises
Uma
and
crise
aggravated by the
econômica, uma crise
pandemics.
social,
It's an
uma
economic,
crise
a
ambiental,
social,
uma crise
environmental,
política e de
political
valores.
crisis, and a
Eu
value
diria
crisis.
que
I
na
would say
base da
that
crise
the
econômica,
foundation
social,
of this economic,
ambiental,
social, and
está a
environmental
crise
crisis
política e de
is
valores.
the
Ela
value
que
and political
são
crisis.
elas que são elementos
These crises
propulsores de
are
todas
what is
essas,
driving,
de
what are
todas essas demais
driving
crises.
these other
E ainda
crises.
fator
And
que
there
precisa
is a
ser
factor
entendido.
that needs to be understood
Dentro da crise ambiental,
within the
nós
environmental
temos o problema
crisis.
da perda
We
da
have the problem
biodiversidade, mas
of loss of
principalmente do
biodiversity, but
problema
mainly
da mudança climática,
in terms
uma
of climate
espécie de
change,
Armagedon ambiental.
we have an
Diante de
Armageddon
quadro como esse,
in face of
como
a
é que a
scenario.
humanidade está
How
se
is
preparando
humanity
para
preparing
enfrentar
to
esses
confront
problemas todos
these
que, como disse,
problems,
estão sendo
as I said,
agravados pela
are
pandemia?
aggravated by the
Como o
pandemics?
nosso continente se
How
integra a
our
esses
continent
esforços de
can
uma
be part of
recuperação
the efforts
econômica,
for an
de
economic
melhoria nas
recovery,
condições
for
de vida das
improving the
pessoas
life
e, ao
standards of
mesmo
people,
tempo,
and at the
cuida
same
do
time
problema da disrupção
care
tecnológica
uh,
e da
or deal with
insegurança
the problem
climática.
of
Esse
technological
desafio,
disruption.
quando eu
This
penso
challenge,
a realidade
when I think about the
da América
reality
Latina,
of
à
Latin
luz
America
de
in light
fenômeno que vem
of a
ocorrendo,
phenomenon that's
segundo as
taking
pesquisas que
place
vêm sendo
according
feitas
to the
pelo
polls that are
Latino
being
Barómetro,
done by the
aonde há
Latino
mais de
Barometer,
25 anos, há mais
which
de
for over
25
25
edições,
years,
eles
uh,
fazem a aferição sobre
they
como
are
anda
measuring
a democracia
how
na América
the
Latina.
democracy,
E
how
na última
democracy is doing
pesquisa
in Latin
trouxe algo
America. In the
preocupante.
last research,
Cerca
we
de
saw something very
13%
worried.
das
Almost
pessoas não
13%
se
of people
importam se o
don't
regime é
care
democrático ou
if we
autoritário. Não
have
se importam se
a
está num regime
democratic
ou
of an
autoritário.
authoritarian
Uma
regime. They
outra
don't care.
parte das
Another
pessoas
part
defendem
of people
a
defend
democracia, mas
democracy,
estão muito
but
insatisfeitos
are very
com os governos na
dissatisfied with
situação
our
atual.
governments
E quando a
as they
gente
are
pega a
now.
questão da
And when we
democracia
look at the issue
como
of
algo que é
democracy
essencial
as
para
something that
resolver os
is
problemas
essential to
econômicos, os
address
problemas
the
sociais, os
economic and
problemas
social and
ambientais
environmental
e uma
problems that we
série
have,
de
and a
outras questões que
number
estão
of other
imbricadas em
issues
tudo isso,
which are
verificar
mixed
o
with
que
all
está
this.
acontecendo
And if
em
we see
países
what
como
is
o Brasil,
happening
por
in countries
exemplo,
like Brazil,
é
for
algo muito
example,
preocupante.
this is something
Eu
very
acabo de
worrying.
ouvir do
I
Andrés
just
que
heard from
acontece no
Andrés
primeiro turno do Chile. Ele
what
disse que
has
algo
happened in the
inesperado
first
aconteceu.
round in
Em
Chile. Something
2018,
unexpected happened. In
todos subestimamos o
2018,
Bolsonaro.
we
E, de
all
repente, algo
subestimated
inesperado
Bolsonaro.
aconteceu.
And something
Governo
unexpected happened.
populista,
A populist
governo
government,
racista,
a racist government,
antiambiental,
an
negacionista.
anti-environmentalist government,
Eu diria que
a reactionary government,
autoritário e
and I would
contra
say
tudo que é
authoritarian
civilização,
and against everything
ganha
that is
o poder no Brasil
civilizatory in
e
Brazil.
faz
They come to government
verdadeiro and they dismantle the environmental governance, the environmental policies, social policies, and the gains that we have gained in the last few years. Coming back to this context, that we will need democracy, in which we will need lasting policies that will not be hostage to this pendulum of left or right governments. We have policies that need to be long-term policies in the short-termism of politicians, regardless of their political side. Quality education, for example, the equality of opportunities that talks about the technological revolution that's taking up and taking lots of jobs, millions of jobs. It's important to think about a transition to a new model of development that will lead to a new cycle of prosperity, ensuring that we should, at the same time, have social justice, the strengthening of democracy, cultural diversity, and environmental sustainability. And we need democracy for this. Without this, it is difficult to deal with all this, especially when we have a denialist government that denies science, not only in terms of climate change, but the social problems, racism that we have in our country, violence, and a number of factors which are things which can damage us a lot in terms of the future, especially when we think about the environment. We're the region that has one of the largest, most important forests for the planet, the Amazon forest, and Brazil has the largest part of this forest. To think of ways out for the crisis that we are going through needs a strategic vision towards this important asset that regulates the planet and that provides the development and the growth of our region. Carlos Nobre, the scientist, when asked by Pope Francis, presented some data that we should consider all the time when we talk about economic growth, economy, and how we're going to return to normality. And he said that around 70% of the GDP of South America is related directly with the rains that are produced by the Brazilian Amazon, by the Peruvian, Colombian, and Bolivian jungle, and so on. To destroy this forest means to compromise almost 70% of our GDPs. And this is something that we should take into account when we think about the new investments that need to be made, the new cycles of prosperity that need to be put forward as a strategic in a moment of crisis we're living through. If we want to go back to processes that were taking place without going forward, we will be going backwards. Perhaps the pandemic is forcing us to move forwards, but this time reassessing our pattern of consumption and distribution of wealth. We can't carry on with having 1% of people who have most of the wealth of the planet to the detriment of environmental presentation, climate security, when millions, billions of people will suffer the consequences of these problems and live in situation of extreme vulnerability. We can't talk about economic recovery if we can't have solidarity between regions. We can vaccinate the whole of our populations in the rich countries, in those middle-income countries. But if we don't have solidarity to those countries who have socioeconomic vulnerability in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America, which thank God, has managed to control the pandemic, despite leaders like Bolsonaro, we won't be able to deal with problems such with the pandemic because it will continue to reproduce itself in other regions and creating new variants which will compromise the efforts that we've managed to make. So in face of this crisis, we are called upon to look for a new form or a new way to move forward in relation to everything, bringing to the Brazilian reality, coming back to the Brazilian reality. I can see many challenges. The challenges to break with polarization. We are divided countries. We have micro-polarizations. And this has to do with our ancestry since the colonization. But now it has become extreme. The idea of building an alternative to polarization, not having to go back to the past, to me, or even to be taken by this present that is destroying our future, means having to think about a project for the country and not just a project for power. What has brought us to these situations is that we think quite often about just grabbing power instead of thinking about a project for the country. What is the horizon? What is the hope for our future so that we're able to think about a new cycle of prosperity in which we can be both socially just, economically prosperous, culturally diverse, and environmentally sustainable and politically democratically. For me, this is the ground for the future. It's our terms of reference that I'm fighting for so that we are able to translate in practice in Brazil. President Lula is leading the polls, but Bolsonaro still has 29%. And now we have the so-called third way, as we call in Brazil, which is absolutely fragmented. And in terms of the center left and center right, is great fragmentation. And this fragmentation, from my point of view, is the fruit of a vision which doesn't contribute to what I referred to before. So I defend that in terms of Brazil, of what's going on in Brazil and Latin America and the world, our challenge is for all of us, to look for a new model, a model that is sustainable for development, to think about sustainability not just as a way of doing things, but as a way of being, as a vision of the world, as an ideal for our lives. Most of our problems, social, environmental, are not just technical problems, but they're ethical problems. We have technical answers to bring energy through wind, through biomass, through the sun, and even through volcanoes. But we are not investing as we should. We have the knowledge to help so that there is no hunger for most of our people. But in my country, we have 23 million people who are vulnerable socially. We have 19 million people who are hungry. And this needs us to search for a new way of how we're going to talk about the elections of 2022. We can't be thinking about just getting to power. We need to have a new pact. We have a little bit of a problem with time. Thank you very much. You have given us a very complete vision of what's going on in these times in Brazil and in Latin America and the elections for next year. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Vanessa to bring us a perspective from Mexico. Thank you very much.
On the contrary, thank you to Chatham House. Thank you, Michael. And it's a pleasure to be in this panel with Andrés, Marina, and Mauricio. So what exactly happened in Latin America? We have heard many shared ideas and contexts here. basically over the last 3 years. In particular, after the uprisings in Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Nicaragua, and other parts of the hemisphere. The rise of energy prices, elections, the increase in transport prices, tax reform, women's rights, political participation were only the tipping points of something deeper and very complex that we are yet to disentangle and understand. The region, as it was said, is worryingly permeated by polarization, populism, radicalization, and authoritarianism, trends that have significantly eroded the still imperfect democratic institutions and the progress we had made in the combat of poverty and inequality. In the latest report of the UNDP, whose highlights have just been shared with us by Marcela Melendez, there is a reference to a mutually determined trap of inequality and slow growth in the region, and the report argues that there's three critical reasons behind it: the concentration of power, violence, and distorted social policy and labor market regulation. Perhaps a fourth element that should be considered in this equation is a general dissatisfaction with democracy. And of course, all these elements have been heightened by the effects of the pandemic and present a gloomy picture of the region ahead. Let me give you now a context of these trends in Mexico. Back in April 1st, 2020, Andrés Manuel AMLO, Mexico's president, mentioned an unfortunate phrase in reference to the COVID pandemic, and I quote, "I have peace of mind that we're doing okay. This is a transitory crisis. This will not last, and we're going to come out strengthened because they're not going to make us change in our purpose that we're going to end corruption and secure justice in the country." This fits like a glove to consolidate the purpose of transformation. And indeed, one can say that COVID crisis fitted the current Mexican government like a glove because it took away the attention from the cancellation of the international airport and an unsettling business environment in general, the lack of economic growth even before COVID hit for the first time in 37 continued quarters, 3.8 million more Mexicans falling into poverty, the backlash in the transition to efficient and renewable energies that Marina was referring to, having passed an education reform that gave back power to trade unions, passing a reform that allows enormous degrees of discretion to imprison someone without previous trial, dedicating a significant part of the budget to financially non-viable pet projects, translating significant amounts of power to the military, attacks on the press, the scientific community, and independent bodies. And in the midst of this historic health and economic shock, it was decided to play fiscal conservatism and be the outlier of the whole region, with only 0.7% of our GDP directed to deal with the twin crisis, with the effects that we heard in the first panel. And guess what? A significant part of the population is not aware or is not sensitive to these facts. Andrés Manuel's popularity nowadays is one of the highest in the region, 64%. And here is when one might think that rationality is falling short to explain reality, but most importantly, we're mainly elites, but most importantly, we should think that mainly elites, but also a good part of the population, we need to understand that a series of forces have been brewing over the years, some with more grounds, some with less grounds, but that doesn't matter. And that social media, for the largest part, but also COVID to a degree, have been catalysts of dissatisfaction, frustration, anger that explains the vast support in governments with limited capacity and, in this case, an authoritarian agenda. And I find a threefold explanation to this. First, people were tired of the status quo, of what Latinobarometer refers to as the selfishness of the elites, that we can explain as an oblivious conduct of those who held economic and political power during the last decades, which implied, and I quote, high degrees of abuse of power, privilege, restriction of plurality, and lack of equality vis-a-vis the law. Second, people took for granted the evolution, perfectible indeed, but evolution that took place over the last 3 decades in terms of democratic advancement and access to social rights. An independent central bank, a citizen-led autonomous electoral body, technical and independent institutions and regulators to provide transparency and certainty to markets. And on social advancement, in the year 2000, 40% of Mexicans lacked sewage. And in 2018, that figure was 6%. 60% in the year 2000 did not have access to health. And in 2018, that figure was reduced to 16%. In the year 2000, 30% of families lived in an overcrowded home, and in 2018, it was 7%. But people have a very legitimate claim for more, better, and quicker. Third, the more moderate alternatives, which has also been shared in this panel, the political center suffered a knockout and hasn't recovered since. It was left disanchored without a reference point. They cannot sell the wonders of democratic, sound, and solid institutions because they have been put into question by corruption and privilege, what you were mentioning, Michael. Ample sectors of the population prefer 20% less democracy and want 20% more salary. Or even worse, some are willing even to sacrifice 20% advancement to earn 20% more and have material access to their aspirations. As Jesus Silva Herzog puts it in his latest book, The House of Contradiction, AMLO was able to name the elephant in the room, privilege and oligarchy. And as the social leader he is, he has an appealing discourse full of popular phrases to attack the status quo and make very wise use of the megaphone in his daily press conferences that many millions watch either due to infatuation or amusement or simply because it is where the national agenda and the national priorities are set on a daily basis. And to end, let me make a brief comment on the electoral manifestations of this melting pot of sentiments and trends. A recent study by Alistair Montfort on electoral preferences and social classes in Mexico has several interesting conclusions derived from a granular analysis of the midterm elections of 2021. Morena, the president's party, managed to have more votes in all socioeconomic classes with the exception of the highest part of the pyramid. They obtained the most votes in the first and second decile, which have an average of 6.3 and 7.4 years of schooling, respectively, and where 92% and 83% of households lack internet access. Morena had indeed a reduction of votes in middle classes, but they still obtain a significant part of their votes from them. So it's only partly true that Morena is losing the middle classes. For different reasons, the two sectors that have the highest electoral participation are the worst off and the better off, but there is a middle class apathy, which can be explained by the fact that they're not easily mobilized, but as Mauricio was mentioning, most importantly, they are not finding options that captivate their emotion to vote. And here is where the opportunity lies. Why should we decide amongst paradoxes, populists or technocrats, effective or ineffective, liberals or conservatives, fact-based or post-truth, democracy or authoritarianism? The political center is fractured, and we urgently need to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. This should be the political priority of our time. It is true that one cannot eat democracy, but it's even more truth that polarization and populism are already eating up the bones of our institutional and social construct. It is daunting to think about the day after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I'm not sure about mouth-to-mouth resuscitation of the pan and the pre, but well, maybe.
Maybe with a mask.
I mean, I think what comes over clearly from what you've said is that so far, Mexico is an exception to the anti-incumbency trend, and for reasons that we should try and understand. We do now have a problem of time, so there are 3 questions online, but I want to see whether anybody who's here has a question, and the usual thing, if you could identify yourself, please, and indicate who your question is to. So over here first, and then over there, please.
Hi, Buenos días, bon dia. Thank you for speaking with us about these issues. It's very important. My name is Melanie, I'm Chatham House staff. So my question is for everyone, but I think it was touched by different points from different speakers. Seeing that, of course, this pandemic exacerbated an already existing brutal inequality that we have had in Latin America since colonial times, and especially with our history of healthcare crises, such as the 2019 swine flu in Argentina and the 2016 Zika epidemic in Brazil and different countries, we can see that it's giving us a momentum for us to really express our public discontent, which is something that characterizes our identity as Latin Americans ourselves. So my question is, to what extent has the COVID-19 pandemic and the momentum it created for the expression of public discontent set the stage for the strengthening of civil society movements, such as those for the protection of the environment, women's rights, and ethnic minorities? And how can we use this stage to materialize these movements in voting patterns and in legislative reform? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take, I think, since we do have a time problem, I'm going to take all the questions. So can you, if the speakers could note the questions down and then reply to the ones that you think you have something to say on. So over here.
Hello, good evening. Good afternoon, actually. I'm a political scientist and master's student at LSE, and I'm Brazilian. My question is, considering that some far-right or anti-democratic governments have been elected over the past few years in Latin America, and written and unwritten rules for the protection of democracy have been broken. In some countries, we are managing to possibly overcome these anti-democratic governments, such as in Brazil, possibly. But we are under the illusion that these anti-democratic forces might simply vanish if these elections are if the elections turn in favor of other candidates. But how can we cope with these forces that possibly are here to stay, and how to govern with these anti-democratic forces that will still be present in the Brazilian society or in Latin America in general?
Okay, very good. Over here.
Thank you, Chair. Judith McGregor, former diplomat, ambassador in Mexico. My question, building on what can civil society do, but what can the opposition parties, what can the centre do, therefore? A lot of analysis about what's going wrong and the institutional problems. What should they do? Go local, go bigger issues, and internationally, interestingly, is there, I mean, a previous question said, what can the UK do? But what can the international community do to try to help to address some of these issues more directly? Institutional culture, I mean, but no one's listening. You know, is it a question of sort of really more targeted investment? Back to the economics. So very quickly, Michael, just those areas.
Good question. Thank you very much. One last question here, and then we've got 3 online. And so there's a lot to answer for the panel.
Thank you. I won't add too much, hopefully. My name is Aditya. I'm a student of Vanessa's actually at the LSE. So I wanted to tie in a couple of themes that a bunch of you mentioned, including in Marina and all of the other speeches. So there's a question of politicization of topics that might otherwise be unifying forces. So Marina mentioned the environment. Others have mentioned things like corruption. And we've also talked about how the collapse of the center in many places has partially resulted because of a lack of emotional resonance. Do you see any solutions going forward for the depoliticization of these important issues, and perhaps a way to motivate the public through emotional resonance in a way that's sort of undone the existing center in many of these countries? Or are there going to have to be other solutions to these problems?
Okay, many thanks. Well, the questions we have online from Martin Diaz Plata, Peru and probably Chile and Colombia. How is the elections of anti-free market politicians going to impact economic growth? Alejandro Deustra, do you think that under the circumstances of divergent international trends and lack of national consolidation in Latin American states, integration still has a significant role to play? Irene Mia, question for Marina Silva. How feasible is fighting deforestation in the Amazon, given the underlying economic model in the region and the little fiscal firepower any future government will have to support a move to a more sustainable economy? What are some of the possible solutions? I'm going to stop there because I think that's enough questions. You've got 4 minutes each to answer those of them you would like to answer. So let's go in the same order. Andrés.
Thank you, Michael. Did you mean 4 minutes total or 4 minutes per question?
I meant 4 minutes total, tragically.
All right,
It's
so
a
that's
kind of
about
Twitter
half a minute
session,
per
but-
question. Let me just take a few. On inequality and social movements, the cliche so far has been that the social unrest in Latin America occurred because of rising inequality. That cannot be right if we look at the data. Until the pandemic, and mind you, much of the social unrest happened before the pandemic, until the pandemic, inequality had been dropping in Latin America, not rising. Yes, we are very unequal societies. Yes, we are very unfair societies, but the simple equation that says inequality went up and therefore unrest went up is, runs into trouble with the facts. We are, free to make up theories. We're not free to make up facts. So we need to explain why is it that falling inequality generated rising discontent. And in my view, that explanation is more political than it is economic or social. And it has to do with something that we have mentioned again and again and again in this session, namely the complete and total collapse in trust for institutions in general and for political institutions in particular. And that is why political reform, changing the rules of the game, recreating political parties in Latin America are gone. There isn't a single country today with working political parties, generating political systems in which you can build majorities, in which governments can govern, in which legislation can be passed, in which negotiation can happen within Congress. All of that is absolutely key. Second question that I'm going to address, what can the center do? A number of things, but let me just highlight a couple. First of all, if the center is going to rise, it has to be a center again. A center which says, oh, I have no ideas of my own, so let me ape the left or ape the right is no center. That was exactly the problem in Chile. The center tried to play left. The center left tried to play extreme left. And as I said in my initial remarks, between Diet Coke and Real Coke, people went for Real Coke. So the first thing that we need to do is remember that there is a distinct set of policies and ideas that the center needs to advocate. They're not those of the populist right. They're not those of the populist left. We have to advocate them without feeling any sense of shame. Secondly, as Mauricio properly said, emotion is too important to be left to the populists. If you think that we're going to persuade the electoral via Excel sheets and technocratic arguments, think again. There's nothing wrong with emotion in politics. Emotion can be manipulated, emotion can be nasty, can be toxic, but emotion is a healthy component of politics. The center cannot do without it. Last but not least, what can the international community do? Well, hopefully not much. Benign neglect is perfectly fine when it comes to the US and maybe also much of Europe, with one exception. It is absolutely key that the international community be very, very clear when populists and authoritarians of the right or the left trample with the rules of democracy. And in that vein, I think it is very good that the EU and the UK and the US were absolutely crystal clear a couple of weeks ago in denouncing the travesty that happened in Nicaragua as exactly that, a travesty. It was not a proper election. Clearly, you cannot have a proper election when the opposition has been locked up, and it's a good thing that the major democracies of the world said so with no ambiguities. Beyond that, respectful silence is perfectly fine. One last thought on growth and how much growth will rise or fall with populists in power. Well, my problem with the question is that it assumes that growth has been happening, and as a result, it can go away. There's been no growth in Latin America recently. Since the end of the commodity boom, since about 5 years ago, the region has grown very, very little. It contracted massively in 2020. It is recovering in some countries very quickly, in some countries not so quickly in 2021. But the IMF is again forecasting that in 2022, Latin America will be the slowest growing region on planet Earth. So the big question when it comes to growth is not so much whether the populists are good or bad for growth. Of course, they're terrible for growth. But the deeper, more structural question is, what are we going to do beyond repeating the old recipes to get productivity and growth going again? My own one-line take is that we need to work much harder at diversifying exports. East Asia grew rich by exporting. Latin America today has a share of world trade that is lower than what we had a century ago. That's a complete embarrassment. If we don't fix that, we're not going to grow. We're not going to become more prosperous. And I would very much welcome a conversation that moved in that direction. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Marina Silva, que pode fazer o próximo governo do Brasil dentro das limitações fiscais para...
What can the Brazilian government do in view of the fiscal limitations? What can the Brazilian government do to reduce deforestation? Thank you very much for the questions. I would like to very briefly make a comment about what the parties should do in the context of so many problems. First of all, it's necessary to acknowledge that we are undergoing a serious political crisis, which requires an updating of politics as new subjects, new actors are coming up. People don't want to be spectators in politics. They want to be actors, serious actors. But political parties are still treating people like spectators. We are no longer living under the direction of trade unions and of parties. No. People are authors, protagonists, actors. So what can we do for us to create an idea that appeals to the collective interest, to the general public, so that we can effect changes? In relation to Brazil and what we can do relative to deforestation, we have to think about another issue. What is the developed world? What the world can do? Of course, when Europe decides that it's not going to sign the Mercosur agreement because of the destruction of the Amazon and the attack on the indigenous peoples, and remember, 8 Yanomami children are now undernourished. I mean, this attitude on the part of Europe helps improve the quality of investments. As regards deforestation, Brazil has given demonstrations that it can reduce deforestation. When I was Minister of the Environment, we reduced deforestation by 83% for nearly 10 years. And we prevented 5 billion tons of CO2 to be put into the atmosphere. This was the biggest contribution ever given in terms of preventing climate change. We created 80% of the protected areas in the world, and we created hectares and hectares of conservation areas. And this attests to what I said. We have the technical answers. What we don't have is political decision and ethical commitment to put knowledge to the service of change. And last but not least, what the world demands from us, and I would like to help build that in Brazil as a citizen, is that we will have to change our view relative to development. Development is not linear. We have to understand that sustainability is important from a social, economic, environmental, political, and ethical standpoint. We have to think about a new way of being in the world, and this has to be translated into policies that are not only for electoral purposes. Sustainability is the hallmark of this century. You can be conservative, but you have to work on behalf of sustainability. And the same goes for the left wing, for the center parties. Everybody needs fertile land, drinking waters, and clean air. This is the challenge for mankind now. Some will be conservative, some will be progressive, but all will have to work on behalf of sustainability. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that's right, that sustainability is one of the great transversal issues of the 21st century. Mauricio.
Well, thank you. I'll try to be brief because I know we're running out of time. The social contract is broken. The lack of trust is generalized. No single institution in the region has support, beginning with the political parties. So we have to reconstruct. And I think the pandemic and the crisis associated with it, it's a good opportunity. So that gives a role for the center, that gives a role for the international community, is a rebuild. And in that process, civil society can play a very important role. We have to worry about ways in which we're going to channel all these insatisfaction in ways that are not necessarily through elections, but other mechanisms to organize ideas, organize platforms, and supporting civil society, supporting organizations is very important. For example, the youth. The movements associated with the youth were captured by the old guard, by the old labor unions. And that, of course, is not right. Second, on growth. Of course, the politics are not favorable because the fragmented politics and the polarized politics are not necessarily good for economic management. But there is an upside too. And that upside I associate with green growth. As Marina was saying, this is something that is very horizontal, it's very transversal. The people from the right, people from the center, people from the left are talking about climate change in Latin America, are talking about the importance of reducing carbon emissions. And I think Latin America has an opportunity, really, because we can produce energy at a lower cost. We have the capacity, so we can be the region of the world that takes an important step in the production of carbon neutral agricultural goods, manufacturing goods. And I think many countries, but especially businesses, are thinking in that direction. So to me, that's an opportunity. Just to end with a positive note. Finally, as Maria, one of the persons that is in the floor in London, said, the pandemic exacerbated inequalities, but it also unveiled the inequalities. People are much more aware now about that. So I think this is a great opportunity so that in our social contract, we don't only strengthen the right-hand side, which is security, defense, the way to deal with crime, but also the left-hand side aspect of the state, which is a long overdue task in the region, which is to make sure that the state reduces inequalities rather than amplifying them. And I think this is an opportunity. There's much more awareness, consciousness about this. And to me, this should also result in better policies, better targeted policies, more effective government programs to reduce inequality. And of course, a whole new conversation about taxation. There's still lots to do in terms of personal income taxes in the region. And I think this will be a great opportunity to fix the fiscal disequilibrium, but at the same time, increase its progressivity.
Thank you very much. Well, because we had one or two technical issues and lost some time to that, I'm going to take a unilateral decision to take 5 minutes from the break. So Vanessa, please give us your concluding thoughts.
I'll be very quick. On your comment, I don't think that it's particularly COVID that gave this broader platform for people to express themselves. It was social media, so it was there before. So one of the aspects I think we should be looking into forward is the role of social media in enhancing or in acting in detriment sometimes of democracy. So I think that's one of the topics that we really need to look into in the future. And I think the ambassador mentioned something quite relevant and a good path in front of us, which is go local. Go local, because that's where you solve people's problems. That's where you create emotion with the people. That's where you have subsidiarity and you solve the most micro problems of the population. And one challenge that we have there is with the political elites. The political elites need to understand that they need fresh leadership and that they need to provide spaces for those local leaders to come forward and to become actual leaders, not only at the local level, but also at the more national level. And just on the international part of what the international community can do, in the case of Mexico, we have 45 countries that we have access to through free trade agreements. Free trade agreements are a huge constraint in terms of Mexico abiding to a certain series of laws and regulations, like climate. So we cannot make decisions domestically that go against the climate decisions we have abided to in these international treaties. So that's basically it.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think this has been a very, very rich and interesting discussion. I think there's a consensus in the diagnosis that an anti-establishment election, Andrés Velasco talked about the collapse of the center. Mauricio talked about an opportunity for reform or the road to disaster. Marina talked about the fact that there are new political subjects in Latin America, new political actors, and there's a kind of civilizational crisis. And Vanessa, you've been talking about how the need to reinvent politics, from the bottom up, as it were. Now, for me, the big question and the big thing we stumble against, and have done for the past few years, is how do you generate a compelling political narrative of democratic reformist change in Latin America. And that has to involve a marriage of ideas, people, and emotion. Yes, emotion. And I agree that emotion is part of politics. Emotion on its own is a perversion of politics. But I think the challenge for the center, and you've said it, is to become less technocratic without becoming less rigorous, to become more political and more engaging without becoming demagogic. And with that, thank you particularly to all those who've asked questions, both online and in person. And now we have a short break, and then we'll be back with the next session. Thank you. And thank you to all the speakers.